Hello, and welcome to Loneliness and You, a podcast on the research and experience of loneliness. I'm your host, Axel Seaman. My guest today is Rosemarie Marino. Rosemarie was born in Berlin in 1939. She was 5 years old when she witnessed her grandmother, Henriette Damerius, being forcibly removed by the Nazis from her family's safe house. Her grandmother was deported to Theresienstadt and murdered there less than a year later. Rosemarie survived the war and at the age of 20 immigrated to the United States. She worked for the head of the physics department at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, where she met and married Donald Marino, who passed away on October the 8th, 2024. She has also worked for Volkswagen of America and for 5 chairmen of BMW of North America. She is now retired and living on Cape Cod. Rosemarie, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's my pleasure entirely.
As you know, we are inviting our guests to bring something to their interviews that represents their experience to them. What have you brought us today?
My experience is as a 5-year-old to watch a very traumatic event in as much as my grandmother, with whom I lived all my life, was taken away from our home forcibly by the Nazis in January of 1944, put on a motorcycle in the middle of January. As I said, it was January, very cold, just with a wrap around her shoulder, and driven away. And that was the last I saw of her. She has been on my mind all my life, even to the point where when the wall fell, I was able to go to Theresienstadt and research her being there. I wanted to see where she was, where she had been. And I found, as the Germans are so good at keeping records, you can find everything. I found easily, not on a computer, but in handwritten form on a piece of paper, her train number, when she left Berlin for Theresienstadt, and when she died there. And it is of some consolation to me to know that she did not go the way many people went from Theresienstadt. They went onto the train. There was a train right from Theresienstadt directly to Auschwitz, and she was not on that train. So I cannot say she died of a natural death, because it is not natural to starve to death, or however people ended their lives there. But it is of some consolation that she did not go to Auschwitz.
Right. Yes, I can see that. And so then you went back to Berlin and there was the Stolperstein. So this is a little
Yes.
memorial. Describe that to us, what that is.
Well, the Stolperstein is I think, a wonderful memorial for people who have no cemetery plot or any place where you can go and say, oh, there is the person that I used to know. Because in this situation, you don't have that. And the Stolperstein was conceived by one person who made it his life's work, and who was an artist. And he had this concept that at the very least, there should be a remembrance of people who have lived there and lived at a certain place. And the Stolperstein will always be put at the last residence of where the person was taken away from. And that, well, in our case, that would be the apartment in Berlin where she had last lived, and where they looked for her, but they found her at our house outside of Berlin. But nevertheless, the Stolperstein belonged to the place where she had spent most of her adult life. And this artist has placed thousands of Stolpersteine in not only in Germany but all over the world where people have had a similar experience or yes, end of life. It in our case, it is not easy to get to Stolperstein uh, put in because it has to be researched. It really has to be absolutely the true report. And it took us about a year and a half to arrange for it. But the interesting part is that this particular artist is the only one who places the Stolperstein. And wherever it is that, whatever country, wherever he is the only one who does that. He has someone who make the cover of it, but he used to do that by himself. But that's too cumbersome. But he had another artist do that. But he is then the person who puts it into the ground. And we had an appointment on the 17th of March in 2017, and at 10:15 in the morning. So I arrived the night before with my grandson, and I had told my friends in Germany that I still have about it. So there was quite a number of people there, and I had someone playing the Querflöte, the flute, and it was done in a very nice way. And he came punctually. He had 3 appointments. This artist had 3 appointments that day in Berlin alone to put the Stolperstein in. I had a very good sense of completion after
Yeah,
he did that.
that's what I wanted to ask you about. What was this like for you? Did you have any kind of sense of closure, as they say in America, or did describe a little bit, your emotional life in that moment?
Yes, I did, because the person is suddenly, a person like this is suddenly gone. And you want to know that they existed. At least that was very important for me. I used to write letters to the editor and things like that whenever it was possible to speak about this kind of a trauma. And I thought the idea of having the stone there at the place where she lived, and we lived too at one time, this was very important for me, and
Yeah.
was more important than have it in the cemetery where people only go, because they know where to go. Here, it is something that people actually stop and look at and realize what happened right here, and that was important to me.
Yeah, I can see that. It took a long time though, to find that closure, an entire lifetime. I mean, we heard you were born in 1939. This was in 2017, so you were 78 years old.
Yeah.
Um, and so this entire life you carried that memory, that trauma with you.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I I also found wherever I could find a memory of her, that's the part that was important to me. So it was important when I went to Theresienstadt to see that there was a record of her. And then at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., that was another opportunity. It was built in 1993, and I went there the first year. And I went to the archives, and there was a book, as I always say, the size of a Manhattan telephone book, with all the people who had perished. But I found her name, and again, the train number and the date and so forth. And I thought that too, to me, was a memorial to her.
Yeah. Before, all of this happened, long before, you tried to make a life in Germany after the war. You didn't, or you grew up at any rate. Describe to us what that was like to live in that country where this had happened to you.
I never felt that I belonged there because I had so little in common with most of the people that I met. How can I explain it? I felt like a stranger
Mhm.
because I realized that if it just had taken a few more years, I too would have been, as I was called, a mixture, a mischling. I would have, it would have been my end as well. Well, my father's end, who was half Jewish and was in a forced labor camp for a while, uh, and never survived. Never, how should I say? He did not live very long after that. It was it contributed mightily to his demise.
Mhm.
This experience of the persecution and the war, and so I never felt I belonged there.
Yeah. And, what I think is often overlooked today is that in 45, it wasn't the case that poof, all of a sudden all the Nazis went away, right?
No,
They were alive and well throughout
of
the
course,
50s.
those
Yeah.
who weren't killed during the war as soldiers or so, and they were right there, and everyone had a history of the war, and there was quite a competition as to whose history is the most important. And it's just, I mean, they were the people who were driven out of Prussia, or East Prussia, or Silesia, and everyone wanted to claim that they suffered the most.
Yes.
So yeah, it's it didn't it I think the real reckoning came in 1968 when
Mhm.
the students, the university students, began to ask the questions of their families. Where were you?
Yeah.
And what did you see?
Yeah.
And they had to own up to the fact that yes, they know that their neighbors were taken away and so forth.
Mhm.
But of course, they didn't want to admit to that. But
That's right. So I'm German, and I grew up in Germany in the 70s and 80s, and I sometimes asked older people, did you not know? Could you not like how could this have happened? And it was very difficult to get answers. Yeah, it was very difficult to get
yeah,
answers.
yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So then at the age of 20, you left it behind and you came to the US.
Yes, and I was lucky. I had a distant relative in Cape Cod who would have. I didn't even know where Cape Cod was, but I came to visit her, and there were them, and that was a wonderful experience because they had to leave Germany, and these were Montessori teachers in Berlin. They had started the first Montessori school in Berlin, um, directed by Maria Montessori, and so they came here ultimately, and it was almost, how should I say this in English, eine Befreiung. It freed me
Mhm.
because there were people who understood me completely. And plus, they were in a wonderful geographic situation. I thought I had died and gone to heaven when I arrived in Cape Cod instead of, where nothing was broken. Whereas Berlin was in 1957, Berlin was just beginning to uh, get built again. And it took many, many more years.
Yeah.
So it was just like another world, and it
Mhm.
was another world.
Mhm.
And I took to it like a duck takes to water.
Yeah. Um, but of course, the past didn't leave you. I mean, we've already heard that you
No,
carried this with you. Were you always aware, like, was it always at the back of your mind while you were building your new life where you came from, or would it just disappear and then pop up again? What's it like to live with
yeah,
something like
it's
that?
it's strange. I have questioned myself uh, as well about that because well, when you're very busy trying to create a new life, and with a husband, I got married very early, and a husband who had his own problems, but he'd go up here in the United States. So it was not uppermost in my mind. Yes, I talked about it if I found someone who was interested, or I had an idea that they might want to talk about it. But it is interesting. I think as I'm getting older, it is much more on my mind than it was before. I think I was just too busy raising two children, and my husband had a PhD, was a professor, as and at ultimately after about 30 years in industry, um, and so I was too busy to dwell on the past. I wish I had not been so busy, because I should have asked more questions, because my mother lived until 1987. And yeah, and even I think I should have asked her more questions,
Mhm.
but anyway, it didn't happen. But now I'm much more um, interested, and realize how it really affected my whole life.
Yeah. So I must imagine that, if that's your formative experience, not only is it with you, but of course it also, you'd imagine, forms your character. For example, I could imagine that it's very hard to trust people just in principle after that. Was that not true?
No, depends. Americans are so open to strangers or to foreigners. They were just amazing, and that I think it is that made the decision for me to immigrate, because I had immediately friends here, and people who didn't who were, how should I say, who were so open to me,
Mm.
and helpful if I needed help. So it was a totally different country to come to. Uh, of course, they also didn't have the history that the Germans had, one way or the other. So they were interested, and they were so open and friendly that I just thought this was wonderful. Of course, I also became aware of the downsides very shortly in the early 60s. We demonstrated against the war in Vietnam. We demonstrated for equal rights for Blacks. And so I became very active.
Yeah, right. So, you came from that experience, and then thankfully, you had a much better one over here. However, one that is also, as you just said, an experience of people excluding others. Do you think we can ever, is it within the purview of the human mind, of the human being, to not exclude others more or less brutally? Can we do that, or is it?
Not to look down on others. I think there must be, I'm sure Sigmund Freud could explain it better than we could, but, there must be something in human nature that, uh, at the very least, they will find something wrong with others, so that they can think better of themselves. I don't know how to
Mhm,
explain that,
mhm.
but there must be something in human nature of that sort, because there are so many in this country now. There are blacks and whites in the South who had the same experience, yet the white people had the advantage of being white. So they had somebody to look down on, even though they were equal economically and, in every way. But they didn't see it that way. They didn't want to see it that way. So that I think there's something in human nature of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And as long as that exists, it's probably easier then also to to be anti-Semitic, because we see this all over again, where right now. Yes.
Absolutely, that's right. It's back. Even in Germany, it's back, right? I mean, it never went away really, but it dares show its face much more. Yeah. Is there? Do you think? What do you? And this is. I don't know whether that's a question you've got an answer to, but what do you think? Do you think there's such a thing as evil? Do you think that?
As evil.
Yeah, that a sort of religious tradition would think
I
of it
am
as the
I
devil.
am I am not a religious person. I'm a humanist, and I mean that's would be my religion.
Yeah.
Uh, so I don't know if there is evil, but there's always the need to be to be better. I mean, we see it right now. I mean, I don't want to get into U.S. politics, but you know, we we are going to have a president who who embodies this kind uh, of an idea
Yeah.
that yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
I I don't know if I call it evil, but it certainly isn't helpful.
And I think we can safely say that. Yeah. I often ask myself, as obviously you would, if you grew up in Germany in the 80s, what would I have done? What would I have done? Because in a way, yes, it's cheap for me to say that. Well, they're my ancestors, some of my ancestors, and they were involved in that. And obviously, it's awful. But of course, the question is, would you have done it any differently, right? Or would I have done it any differently?
I'm very glad. Even when I was in Germany, I was always glad that I've had the history that I had because I didn't have to ask myself that question.
Right.
So I could take the high road,
Mhm.
but I understand that fully
Yeah.
that that one would ask that question.
Yeah. And, the answer is not obvious. Sort of one trusts oneself to be halfway decent as long as the conditions are favorable, but what if it
Yeah.
really requires a sacrifice, to do the right thing? Are we up to that test? And I don't know that about myself because I haven't had to face
No,
that
and I
test.
hope we don't all get tested
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
because,
Yeah, exactly. In the light of your life experience, what can one do to resist?
well, you
What?
have to, well, I think, well, because of my experience in Germany, I've I feel that I owe humanity something, and so I try to be as active as I can. Not now I'm getting older and it's getting more difficult to be active, but I was very active in as my children grew up, and they definitely benefited from my experience. And my husband and I, we both were very active. I led a human rights committee in where we lived in New Jersey. It was a very big. We were very close to New York City, so it was our county had millions of people.
Mhm.
So I was very active there, and well, one experience was that we would tell the police whenever we would go away so that somebody would keep an eye on the house.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened, but one time we were probably to Cape Cod because we had a summer house here. Um, Someone had put our water hoses in the front door and into the back door and put the water and turned the water on. And I'm not sure that this had anything to do with the police, but they certainly didn't notice this.
Right.
Luckily, the storm door held, and the water didn't go flood the house, but
Mhm.
it could have happened. And I think that had to do with the fact that we were so active.
Yeah. 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 Do you? So so I live abroad as well. And I look back on Germany, and it was capable of this horrible thing, but it's of course also produced wonderful things. It's produced, some of the most beautiful literature, some of the most beautiful music in
Yeah.
in 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 the world. And do you? you said, you moved away and you didn't want to have anything, you didn't identify with those people. Do you see, somebody like Bach or Beethoven as sort of, do you still feel, because these were also Germans, what do you feel about that? Yeah.
I was a patron at the Metropolitan Opera. I was a member of Carnegie Hall, and of course, even though I have to say, Wagner was not my favorite composer for many reasons, but art has nothing to do with that. I mean, there is no way that I could possibly dislike an artist because he was German and possibly, I don't know, It is interesting. The anti-Semitism is just everywhere. Just recently I read about Niemöller, who had that wonderful saying, when they came for the Jews, I wasn't Jewish, and I didn't do anything. When they came for whoever else, and then in the end, when they came for me, there was no one there, and I read up on him just last week. I Googled, and to find out he was totally anti-Semitic. That's how he started out. Now, later on, I think he changed his mind.
Mhm.
But at first, he went along with Hitler. I had no idea. But because I had that saying on the refrigerator door for years,
Yeah.
thinking that he thought as I would. But even there was that spark. And it wasn't a good one.
No. Right.
It was very surprising.
Yes. Yeah.
I think I digress. But
No, you don't. I mean, this is all part of it.
yeah.
It's very difficult sometimes to clearly separate, what's what in that context. Yeah.
No, I think I favor people where I have an idea that they are absolutely beyond reproach.
Yeah.
For example, Stefan Zweig
Yes.
is one person that I admired tremendously,
Yes.
and I even went to see his where he took his own life north of Rio de Janeiro.
Hmm.
I mean, there were people like that.
Yeah.
But of course, they're also Jewish, so.
Right. But very many of the greats don't have a totally clear slate in that context. David Hume does not, and in philosophy, had sort of was not good about other races. Kant also, Kant had a ranking
Yeah,
of the
I
races.
mean, I quote Kant all the time when it's convenient. He said about dying. He has a wonderful saying that the only person who is truly dead is the one who's forgotten.
Mm.
He says it in a more flowery way. But I quote that a lot because now that my husband died, and it gives me a sense of it's a positive feeling.
Yeah.
But you're right.
Yeah.
You can find this kind of thinking everywhere.
Yeah. So we must do what we can to remember what has happened and try to learn from it as best as we can.
That's right. That's right. And as Elie Wiesel said, listening to a witness makes you a witness. So even though most of the actual witnesses are almost all gone,
Mhm.
but there are still some people who, and that's good.
Yeah. I think this is a good way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for making the time for me. It was wonderful to
It's
talk to
my
you.
pleasure entirely.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Loneliness and You, a podcast on the research and experience of loneliness. My guest today was Rosemary Marino. If you want to join the conversation or have suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at lonelinnesspod loneliness@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at loneliness.pod. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Loneliness and You wherever you get your podcasts. Loneliness and You is produced by Stacey Goldman and myself, Axel Seaman. This episode was engineered and edited by Steve Selina. Our introductory sound was designed by Dave Micken, and our logo art is by Paul Fisher-Davies. The podcast is financially supported by Bentley University. Thanks again for listening. Talk soon.